Welcome to This Explainer. You know, before the very first shot was even fired, before a single drop of ink hit parchment, and way before a brand new nation literally rose from the ashes of the massive British Empire, there were some fundamental questions being asked that ended up, well, changing the world forever. Today, we are unpacking the American War of Independence.
So how exactly did 13 colonies defeat an absolute empire? This is the core question we need to keep in mind right from the jump. How did a scattered, kind of ragtag group of coastal colonies, originally just landless peasants, merchants, and folks seeking religious freedom, how did they transform from loyal British subjects into a sovereign, democratic republic that actually took down a global superpower? Let's trace that whole cause and effect journey.
Section 1. Roots of the Rebellion. How cordiality turned into serious tension.
Okay, let's dive into this. The relationship between the colonies and Britain absolutely didn't start out hostile. Early on, it was actually quite friendly. But the friction fundamentally started with, you guessed it, economics. Britain operated under this super strict policy known as mercantilism. Basically, this doctrine meant the colonies existed for one single purpose, to enrich the mother country. They were expected to just provide raw materials and act as a captive market. It was an absolute iron grip on trade, entirely designed to funnel wealth in just one direction.
And to enforce that mercantilist policy, the British Parliament rolled out a series of completely suffocating trade restrictions. First, the Navigation Acts forced colonists to only use English ships for all their exports and imports. Then came the Molasses Act, slapping these incredibly heavy duties on imported sugar. And get this, the Hat Act of 1732 literally prohibited colonists from importing hats from one colony to another. I mean, imagine not being able to buy a piece of clothing just because it was made one town over. Plus, the Iron Act of 1750 stopped any large-scale iron production right in its tracks. You can really start to see the bitterness developing here, right? The colonists were being economically choked out and were just desperate for a chance to break free.
Section 2. The Breaking Point. A dangerous new confidence.
Now, this shift toward outright defiance really hit the gas after the 7 Years' War ended in 1763. With the French threat completely gone, the colonists developed this dangerous, undeniable new sense of confidence. But on the flip side, Britain unleashed a relentless wave of oppressive acts known as the Granville Measures. Looking at the timeline, boom, in 1763, a proclamation bans colonists from buying land beyond the Appalachian Mountains. 1764 brings the Sugar Act. 1765 brings the Stamp Act, forcing folks to use British stamps on literally all legal documents. Oh, and the Quartering Act forced colonists to actually house and feed English troops in their own homes. Finally, in 1767, the Townshend laws taxed glass, paper, and tea. It was a rapid, absolutely overwhelming legislative assault.
And no surprise here, the colonies absolutely erupted. Violence broke out in the streets, and this massive rallying cry echoed across all 13 colonies. No taxation without representation. The fury over these policies was so intense, it actually led to sheer tragedy. On March 5, 1770, British soldiers opened fire on American protesters in what became known as the Boston Massacre, tragically leaving 5 Americans dead. Now, the Townshend laws were eventually repealed, but honestly, the fire was already lit.
Now, what's really interesting about this next part is the sheer theatrical fury of the colonial response. In 1773, Britain passes the Tea Act, mostly just to flex and prove they still had the right to tax. So, on the night of December 16th, colonists actually dressed up as Red Indians, boarded British ships, and hurled every single chest of tea into Boston Harbor. It was an event immortalized as the Boston Tea Party. And Britain's response? They dropped a heavy hammer of punishment, known as the Intolerable Acts of 1774.
Section 3. Declaring Independence. Uniting the colonies.
At this point, the colonies realized they had to unite. They gathered at the Continental Congress, and after their final pleas for peace, the Olive Branch Petition, were flat out rejected by King George, who declared a state of rebellion. Something massive shifted. In January 1776, a 50-page pamphlet arrived that completely rewired public consciousness, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It ruthlessly attacked the whole idea of a hereditary monarchy on one hand, while fiercely advocating for a democratic government on the other. Over 1 lakh copies, that's 100,000 copies, were distributed. It spread like wildfire. It gave the American people the exact intellectual ammunition they needed to start envisioning total independence.
And that intellectual fire led directly to the day that quite literally changed history.
July 4, 1776. The Declaration of Independence is officially adopted by the Continental Congress. Picture the hushed, momentous atmosphere as a committee of 5, led by Thomas Jefferson, drafted this profound document. It firmly embedded the radical ideals of human freedom straight into the foundation of a brand new nation.
So the crucial point here is the massive emphasis the Declaration laid on the unalienable rights of all men: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Take a second to really let that sink in. These weren't just pretty words on a page. They were a complete, fundamental, philosophical rejection of imperial rule, officially codified into the birth certificate of the United States.
Section 4. Battles for Freedom. Defending those new ideals.
Now, picking up the pace a bit, in reality, the physical war had actually already kicked off before the Declaration was even signed. As you can see on this timeline, after the initial clash with the colonial militia at Lexington back in 1775, things were looking pretty grim. In 1776, British forces handed Commander-in-Chief George Washington a tough defeat at the Battle of Long Island. But Washington's incredible resilience held the army together. By 1781, the tides had shifted completely, culminating in British General Cornwallis surrendering at Yorktown and the war officially ending with the Treaty of Paris in 1783.
But wait, if we look closely right at the middle of that timeline, we find the true game changer, the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. General Gates and the American colonial army secured this massive turning point victory against the British. Why was it the turning point? Because this specific win actually convinced France to jump into the war on the American side. French troops, under commanders like Lafayette, provided the absolutely crucial support that made that final British surrender at Yorktown inevitable.
Section 5. A Global Legacy. Looking beyond the war.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because with the war officially ending in 1783, we have to look past the battlefield to see the profound aftermath. The political result was completely unprecedented, the world's very first democratic republic, complete with a written constitution and a Bill of Rights, heavily utilizing the French thinker Montesquieu's concept of the separation of powers. Economically, capitalism started taking really strong roots, and globally, it became a massive fight against aristocracy and colonial domination itself, directly inspiring the French Revolution just a few years later.
However, when we're analyzing the reality of 1783, we absolutely have to look at the complete historical picture. While these monumental democratic ideals of freedom and unalienable rights were being established for the Republic, the promise of freedom hadn't yet been extended to everyone. Specifically, as a matter of historical fact, the rights of the native Red Indians and of enslaved Negroes were simply not considered by the nation's founders at that time.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how complex and world-shifting the American War of Independence truly was. July 4th, 1776 wasn't just the birthday of a nation, it was the birth of a radically new idea, that a government derives its power solely from the consent of the governed. It totally redefined what a nation could even be. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to ponder. If a scattered group of coastal colonies could successfully demand their freedom and completely rewrite the rules of global power, what other seemingly impossible revolutions are just waiting for their own spark?